From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Matt Gaetz withdraws from consideration to be Attorney General, saying his confirmation was becoming an unfair distraction to the Trump transition.
Sudden move raising questions now about Gaetz's future in Congress and the fate of the House ethics inquiry into him. We'll be joined this hour by someone who used to chair that committee, former Congressman Charlie Dent.
And we'll have more on another Trump nominee facing intense scrutiny. Defense Secretary-designate Pete Hegseth with a former Navy helicopter pilot, Democratic Congresswoman Mikie Sherrill, who will also discuss her candidacy to be New Jersey's next governor. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday edition of Balance of Power. As we come to air this evening, still no news on the selection we all care so much about. The Treasury Secretary remains in question. But the news we were not expecting to get, the departure of Matt Gaetz from consideration for the AG role, now one that has rocked this transition. It's the first real failure we have seen for the president-elect.
That's true. He announced it on X in a post just hours ago. In fact, we learned this together on the early edition of Balance of Power. Reaction coming steadily from Capitol Hill since then, particularly in the Senate. Let's listen.
I respect his decision, appreciate him offering himself for service at that level, now on to somebody else.
I'm sure it's the right decision if he feels like it is and the president feels like it is. The president deserves to have a cabinet who is going to implement his agenda and serve his interests. And so I saw the president's statement, and I trust his decision.
His confirmation process will move more quickly and be more successful if he nominates more confirmable candidates.
We're joined now by Bloomberg's Laura Davison and Gregory Korte for more on this and other cabinet selections facing scrutiny. Laura, if we can just begin with Matt Gaetz. Clearly, we all saw the writing on the wall here. It was going to be very difficult for him to get to the requisite votes to receive Senate confirmation. But to drop out this early and in this fashion, what does it signal about the kind of choice Donald Trump is going to be able to put forward to serve this role in his stead?
It suggests that he's going to have to go with a lot safer of a pick. Remember, Gaetz was just nominated like a week ago. So this is a really stunning reversal. And he's not someone who, shies away from a sign of conflict. He, likes to kind of charge forward, head forward into that. So there's already been some names floated. Someone like Jay Clayton might be someone who's already been, Trump has already picked for Southern District of New York, but could elevate up to Attorney General Todd Blanche, his lawyer from his hush money trial, potentially. So there's already a lot of more conventional picks that are sort of in the milieu. So we'll see kind of how that goes. Right now, Mar-a-Lago is totally distracted with Treasury Secretary. There's lots of names flying, lots of meetings happening, and they're still trying to land that one, which has really dogged him for days.
So presumably Matt Gaetz's meetings with senators didn't go quite as well as planned yesterday for him to come out with this today. But it raises some more questions, Gregory Korte. Number one, will the ethics inquiry into Matt Gaetz be released? I know there's a Democratic effort to force a floor vote to make that happen post-Thanksgiving. There are also questions, though, about whether Matt Gaetz shows up for the job in January. He was elected to the 119th Congress and could do a George Costanza in the new year here, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly how I put it when I talked to some experts on this. I fell down a little bit of a rabbit hole this afternoon trying to figure out what happens to Matt Gaetz, because he technically resigned from the 118th Congress. He was just elected to the 119th Congress. He said in his resignation that he doesn't intend to take the oath. Is that binding? Right. Or could he just show up and be sworn in anyway? One important thing to remember is that Matt Gaetz is not particularly popular on either side of the aisle of the House. He was the guy who engineered the coup against former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. There were a lot of hurt feelings over that. And so to the extent that the House determines what its membership is, likely they may not choose not to seek him. But also remember, this is a very evenly divided House, maybe 2 or 3 votes, and Trump has appointed 2 of them to prime positions in his administration. And so there's not a whole lot of room. They might need Matt Gaetz's vote, and they might not be, willing to wait until a special election can bring in another likely Republican to that seat.
Well, it's an excellent point. For now, though, certainly when it comes to the nomination confirmation questions, we know the answer for Matt Gaetz. For some of the other more controversial picks, the president-elect president-elect has made, though, this could perhaps put even greater scrutiny on them, like the nominee for Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who was on Capitol Hill today to meet with senators and make his own case for confirmation a day after a police report involving sexual assault allegations against him was released. Here's Hegseth this morning.
I just want to thank the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, who spent the morning with me, meeting with senators of the United States. We take very seriously the advice and consent role that the U.S. Senate has. We look forward to engaging in that process. We take absolutely nothing for granted, and we welcome the opportunity to talk to any senator that wants to talk to us.
Did you sexually assault a woman in Monterey, California?
I have, as far as the media is concerned, I'll keep this very simple. The matter was fully investigated, and I was completely cleared, and that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you very much.
So as we consider the defense secretary designate's future here, Laura, has there been any indication from the Trump transition team that they are rethinking this or might encourage him to withdraw himself, as Matt Gaetz did, rather than wait or risk a confirmation vote going down on the Senate floor?
Not yet. However, I'll note that there's a long time before Hegseth will actually face a confirmation hearing and confirmation vote. That's 2 months from now, essentially, perhaps a little bit more. And just in the past 10 days or so since his name has come up in association with the Pentagon chief job, there's already been sort of a drip, drip, drip of things coming out. We could see a lot more that could force Republican senators to say, hey, look, we don't want this guy. We've seen, some folks come out and say affirmatively, yes, I think he should be able to do the job. But others have really withheld judgment and say we want to let this process play out. There's a lot of runway there. Hegseth is partially harmed in his positioning here because, one, he is not only has these sexual assault allegations against him, but also is not widely considered to be a highly qualified pick for this job. He doesn't have the military experience that someone typically would, so that could be 2 strikes, and a third could be potentially fatal for him.
Well, there's still one big blank we're waiting to fill in here. You mentioned it right off the top, Kayleigh. That's Treasury Secretary. We're getting spoiled with all these early announcements, I feel like. Gary Cohn reminded us this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance that it was the week after Thanksgiving that Donald Trump hired his economic team in the first administration. But Bloomberg's Shonali Bosick spoke today with Citadel CEO Ken Griffin about the open Treasury Secretary role. And some of the names here in contention, Mark Rowan of Apollo Global Management specifically, here's what he had to say.
Mark is clearly one of the great thought leaders in alternative asset management. And if Mark is offered the opportunity to be Secretary of Treasury, please take the job.
It's got a couple boxes to check here, we're told, Gregory. He's got to make Wall Street happy, make MAGA happy, and be really good on TV. Are we getting any closer?
Yeah, Mark Rowan is an interesting guy, and he's one that I've been following personally over the past year or so because he's one of those billionaires that we were watching to see which side of the fence will he fall off of. He was never sold on Trump. He was never sold on Biden. He's gotten a little Trumpier in the past few weeks, and especially after the election. Some of his public comments have been very bullish on Trump. He certainly, as we heard from Ken Griffin, he would make Wall Street happy, would not make MAGA happy. He's a private equity guy. And there are huge swaths of this country that blame private equity and Apollo's, specifically, Mark Rowan's firm, for this economic disruption that we have seen that's led to the elimination of so many manufacturing jobs.
That's an excellent point. So as we consider Rowan or Kevin Warsh, Bill Hagerty, Scott Bessent, these are names who have been floating out there for some time. Laura, if it was going to be one of them, wouldn't it have happened already? Or is it likely when we get this choice, it's going to be someone who we did not previously understand to be on the short list?
It's clear that Trump is not happy and not sold on any of his choices yet. If he were, he would have picked someone. But he may also be, we know that they are looking at kind of the comprehensive team. Okay, who do you slot into the Treasury Secretary job, National Economic Council? Who do you put as the trade rep? So some of that machinations is what's happening right now. So it could be one of these names, but do not rule out that it's a total dark horse pick and we could be completely surprised in a name that nobody's prepared for.
Be very on brand. Bloomberg's Laura Davison and Gregory Korte, thank you so much for great reporting and insights. Coming up, our conversation with Democratic Congresswoman Mikie Sherrill will be with us for more reaction on the withdrawal of Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, as well as her recently announced run for New Jersey governor. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Well, that obviously had to happen. And, unfortunately, he and frankly, so many other potential cabinet nominees by President Trump, one commonality, one common theme is that many of them have allegations of sexual abuse and being sexual predators. And for me, it's just mind-boggling. It's stunning that folks of this character or lack thereof are being considered for cabinet posts. So that was the right thing to do. He never had a chance.
Former Education Secretary Arne Duncan on the early edition of Balance of Power today, offering what was instant reaction at the time of the withdrawal of Matt Gaetz for consideration for the role of U.S. Attorney General. That is where we begin our conversation today with Democratic Congresswoman and New Jersey gubernatorial candidate Mikie Sherrill. Congresswoman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I want to connect the dots here a little bit to start off, because you said in your first run for Congress, quote, "The attack on the institutions of our government was disturbing to me. It's part of the reason why you've decided to run for governor." You said in your campaign announcement, "After this election, we know people are more divided than ever on how to move forward." When you consider attacking institutions, some thought that is exactly what Donald Trump was trying to do by naming Matt Gaetz in this role. Now that he is withdrawn as a member of Congress, will you vote still to release the Ethics Committee report into Matt Gaetz?
Well, I certainly think that we should understand what he has done. I don't think we've precluded that he might come up again for another nomination, or that Trump might try to bring him in some way, shape, or form to his inner circle. So I think we should understand better what we're dealing with. So I would certainly like to see that report. But it is somewhat breathtaking, all of these allegations against people that Trump is considering for high-level positions. But I think what I remain as concerned about is the sense that these are undermining the institutions. So we've heard reports that the administration wants to court-martial all the admirals and generals to create, I assume, some sort of loyal force to Trump, not to the Constitution. We hear that the proposed Secretary of Defense not only has some of these allegations out there, the sexual assault allegations, but also has said that he doesn't think women should serve in combat, which really, I think, presents a grave misunderstanding of how our forces fight right now. And even some of the details of how, as I've said before, how we clear houses with women in there, and we're not going to win the hearts and minds of the people that we really want to bring into the fold of democracy if we are going in ways that are very contrary to their cultures. And I guess all of this is largely the reason I'm running for governor, because we are going to need strong leaders in this country who are going to continue to protect our government, who are going to continue to promote our values, and continue to protect all the things that we hold dear.
Well, we do want to get into your gubernatorial candidacy, Congresswoman, but if I could just go back to what you referenced, the Defense Secretary designate Pete Hegseth, who obviously is facing allegations surrounding sexual assault, but also has some very specific beliefs in regard to the role women should play in the military. Reminding our audience here that you were a Navy helicopter pilot. Is it that disqualifies him in your mind from the job, or questions of character?
Well, I would say both. Certainly the questions of character. I think, again, I realize that there were no charges brought, but certainly I'd like to know more about the payment he made to the woman who had those allegations against him. So the character questions concern me very much, as do the sense that he has these very particular views. Look, if you sort of attacked women's service in the way he has, that would be really concerning to any commanding officer in the fleet right now. If you were, a member serving in our military and you espouse some of these views, you'd be pulled in for a conversation, because that would be contrary to unit morale and cohesion. We have women serving, and I can tell you I graduated 30 years ago in the first class of women that were available for combatant ships and aircraft. And imagine 30 years of service. Imagine all that we have now built. We have a woman who's been a commanding officer of an aircraft carrier. the chief of naval operations, the highest person serving in uniform, is a woman right now. The person heading the Naval Academy, where we train the fleet, and many members of it, is a woman. And the brigade commander, the position that you get when you are one of the most high-performing midshipmen in the entire Naval Academy brigade, is a woman. So we've made all these strides because I think we have such a great fighting force with people from all over and all different backgrounds that are doing so well. And to think that you're going to have a Secretary of Defense undermine that service and undermine the people that want to serve their country. And I know what that looks like, because 30 years ago, we didn't have that cohesion. We were dealing with proceedings or Naval Institute articles saying that women can't fight by a former Secretary of Defense, James Webb. We were dealing with a chief of naval operations that said women would never serve on submarines in his lifetime. We were dealing with don't ask, don't tell. We have built so much, and it has continued to make us a strong, resilient force. And I would hate to see a Secretary of Defense that had as his agenda and goal tearing that apart.
Well, while we're talking about the Pentagon here, I want to just steer our attention to the rest of this lame duck session, Congresswoman, because there's a big question about government funding. As we lapse on December 20th, the idea of a continuing resolution deep into next year or potentially to September, as some of Donald Trump's supporters are suggesting, to, quote unquote, clear the decks for him so he doesn't have to worry about the budget process in his first year. This has many defense hawks up in arms, saying that that's the equivalent of a budget cut for the Pentagon. How will you weigh in on that in one of your final acts in this Congress?
What kind of president can't handle a budget in his first year? I mean, why run for the office if you think that's beyond your capabilities? We have seen the least effective House of Representatives under this Republican majority in the history of this country. We still haven't passed the appropriations bills and the National Defense Authorization Act. Yes, it is horrible for how we move forward on a lot of the projects and programs in our military, and a huge cost to that, because a lot of programs stall then, and to restart them is a huge tax on every American as we try to restart this and have to add more to the defense budget. It's just a really, really poor way to run a country, and certainly, again, if this president, if this administration doesn't feel as if they can handle governing, then why take the job?
Well, you're looking for a new job, Congresswoman. As we've mentioned, you're running for governor of New Jersey after we just saw your state in this election cycle in every county move a bit more to the right. And I'm wondering, given that dynamic and a crowded Democratic field already, why you think it is now that it's time to toss your hat into the ring?
So I think because what I've seen in my district was our ability to overperform the top of the ticket. The ability of mayors and council people who've served their districts and their towns and their municipalities really, really well to continue to perform well. In Morris County, which is generally the more red part of my district, we didn't lose any seats in the Democratic Party, and actually were able to flip control in some towns. So I think when you really work incredibly hard with everyone and listen to people, bring people together around solutions, it's very powerful. That's why, yes, as I said in my opening video, it feels as if we're more divided than ever. And what's coming out of Washington, I think, is really toxic to bringing Americans together to solve some of the key issues that we have to solve. And we've been very successful in northern New Jersey, I think, in bringing a lot of people together around issues like flooding or car theft or prices and affordability, or getting rid of the state and local tax deduction cap, or funding the Gateway Tunnel. These are things that we care about, and just really good governance, while at the same time being the type of state that welcomes innovation and welcomes different voices that are going to bring us into the future.
All right, Democratic Congresswoman and New Jersey gubernatorial candidate Mikie Sherrill, thank you for joining us. And we should note we are asking her opponents to join us as well. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. We thank you for joining us. An arrest warrant has been issued by the International Criminal Court for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Joining us now, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who leads our national security team here in Washington. Nick, how seriously should we be taking this?
Well, as an expression of intent and anger globally about the Israeli campaign in Gaza and the mounting death toll, it's quite serious and unprecedented. Whether there's any chance, though, that the Israeli prime minister, his former defense minister, will go before the ICC, I would say it's extremely unlikely. Israel is not a signatory to the ICC. It's obviously vehemently against this arrest warrant and says that it is unwarranted. Also, the United States coming out, both President Joe Biden and President-elect Donald Trump have been in opposition the ICC push against Israel for a long time. They say the country has functioning courts and there's no need for it. So a serious sign of anger, but really I don't think you're going to see Netanyahu anytime soon testifying before the ICC in The Hague.
And Nick, if we could also ask you about another conflict. Ukraine said Russia launched a new kind of ballistic missile at it today, maybe an ICBM. What exactly do we know about this weaponry?
A major escalatory step by Russia. This was what's not an intercontinental ballistic missile, but essentially a medium-range ballistic missile. So still very, very serious, but not quite with the range. But, you know, what you have seen in the last few days is this series of escalatory steps by both sides. The U.S. allowed its long-range weapons to strike from Ukraine into Russian territory. It's added more sanctions on Russia. The U.K. also allowed for some of its weapons to be fired into Russia. So this is the response. It's sending a message both to Ukraine and also its Western backers, Russia saying, hey, listen, if you're going to do that, we can play this game too. And the bigger, larger looming threat out there, of course, is that Russia could hit territory of countries beyond Ukraine and its allies. So that's something that the U.S. is going to need to think deeply about.
Well, and it's something we'll continue to watch and look for your continued reporting on from you and your team. Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, thank you so much. And still ahead, we'll turn back to domestic politics as Matt Gaetz' withdrawal from consideration for Attorney General is raising questions about a few things. Who will be AG in his stead? Will he return to Congress in the 119th? And what becomes of the House Ethics Committee's inquiry into him? Former Republican Congressman Charlie Dent, who used to chair that committee, will join us for more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This information should come out. We will continue to push in our office to make sure it comes out because the allegations are serious and it is in the good of the House and it is in the good of making sure that the American people trust that the House holds itself to account, that we know what's in this report.
Matt had alienated so many people on both sides of the aisle that we expected quite a few Republican votes to actually see the report. It's less important now unless he decides to come back. He won the election. He resigned from this Congress, but he hasn't resigned from the next Congress yet. So this may be not moot yet.
Democratic Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois and Don Beyer of Virginia on the early edition of Balance of Power today, weighing in on the future of the Ethics Committee report into Matt Gaetz, now that Gaetz has pulled himself from consideration for Attorney General. So joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Charlie Dent. He is former Pennsylvania Republican Congressman and former chair of the House Ethics Committee. Sir, thank you for being with us. Obviously, Gaetz is no longer a cabinet nominee, at least at this time. He is also not a current member of the House of Representatives, having resigned. So if you were still chairing this committee, how would you move forward?
Well, I want to say there is precedent to releasing committee reports after a member has resigned or departed from Congress. So, in fact, there was a case in 1990 where there were allegations of a member having sex with a 16-year-old member resigned and a report was issued after he resigned. So that's not a new thing. There are other reports that were issued after the fact as well. And I could list several cases where the committee made various public statements or took action after members resigned. And so I think it's entirely appropriate to release this report. And again, I should always point out too, when members of Congress resign due to scandal, they usually go away quietly. That is, they go about the business of reconstructing their lives, their relationships, and repair things with their families. They need to do this. But they don't get promoted or get elevated to become the top law enforcement officer of the United States. And that's why this report is taking on such great urgency, because the U.S. Senate wanted this report as part of their official record in terms of their confirmation process. They wanted to see it. And frankly, a lot of the American people probably want to see it too. They'd like to know about the top law enforcement officer as well, if there are really serious allegations of sexual misconduct.
Well, Congressman Matt Gaetz isn't exactly going home to lay down in Florida. The options at the moment include potentially returning to Congress, as he won his election for the 119th. That remains unclear. He could still get a job inside the White House that does not require confirmation in the Senate. He could also be named, presumably, for the open Senate seat that's about to emerge in Florida when Marco Rubio, again, is presumably confirmed for Secretary of State. Do those heighten the urgency, the need to release this report now, because he may still be a key figure in Washington?
Well, I think now that he is withdrawn, now that his name has been withdrawn, that takes a little bit of the pressure off, but not that much, because Matt Gaetz, this has been pointed out, has a lot of enemies, and most of those enemies are within the Republican Party, and I suspect a number of them would like to see him kneecapped right now. But putting that aside, the political motivations. The issue is, he may go back into government, and these are very serious allegations. It appears that this investigation was, in fact, completed prior to his resignation. The only thing that they were waiting to do was to actually vote on it and the actual report language, which, I'm not sure is actually final, but close to final, probably, having served on that committee. And I'm sure, and this report is the reason why he did resign from Congress. If this report was going to be some kind of an exoneration or a clean bill of health, he would not have resigned. He's resigning because these reports usually talk about sanctions, reprimand, censures, expulsion in the worst cases. They talk about even if there's potential criminal wrongdoing, they can refer that to the Justice Department. They'll talk about bringing discredit upon the House. These are not pretty reports. And that's why he left, thinking that the Congress would lose jurisdiction, which they technically do. But it's only been a courtesy. It's a custom or a courtesy that the committee not release reports. It is not a rule. There is no rule that prohibits the release of a report after a member has departed. And there are circumstances where it is warranted, and I happen to think this is one of them.
Well, the Speaker of the House doesn't seem to be in agreement with you on that. He suggests that there could be bad precedent set here. We've heard others do the same. And as we consider the ideas of precedent or the traditional process of the House as an institution, Congressman, I'm sure you've heard, as we all have, the idea that even if this is not formally issued, it could very well leak out, that the Democrats could decide, for example, to just put it out there or read it on the House floor anyway. But I wonder if that gives you some concern about the integrity of the Ethics Committee as part of an institution that is there to hold members to these ethical standards and to hold them to account.
Well, let me say something. I disagree with the Speaker on this. I think he should not have said anything, frankly. He should have just his statement should have been, we'll let the committee do its work, and we have a bipartisan committee, 5 members from each party. I trust them to make a good judgment. That's what he should have said, and not weighed in on this. But as to the precedent, Let me in 2018, a former congressman named Blake Farenthold resigned, and after he left, the committee made a public statement, and that issue had to deal with sexual harassment, and then there was some kind of settlement after that. So they made statements after he resigned. Mark Foley, you may remember, had sent inappropriate text messages to pages, congressional pages, were under 18. And after he resigned abruptly, the Ethics Committee actually deposed current sitting members of Congress to ask them about what they knew about this case. So even though they lose jurisdiction perhaps over that member, it didn't mean that the matter died entirely. And they, like I said, there was plenty of precedent. And there was another case back in 1987 where a member had resigned, and the committee issued a report for this member's misconduct. There were issues of bribery, misuse of campaign funds, and other things. So it's not like this is so there's no precedent being set here. And, I think a lot of people in the American public might want to know. And if he does get a position in government or other higher office, again, a lot of folks might like to know the facts of this circumstance. And these are professional investigations. They are well done. They're nonpartisan investigations, and they're very thorough.
We're reliving the greatest hits here with Charlie Dent. Congressman, lastly, when you look at this in the aggregate, the names beyond Matt Gaetz that Donald Trump has put forth to fill out his cabinet, how difficult of a position is he putting Republican senators in when this confirmation process begins?
Well, look, some of President-elect Trump's nominations are quite good. He's got Marco Rubio, Lee Zeldin. He's got other folks, Doug Collins at the VA. He's got other well-known folks like Elise Stefanik. Nobody's going to question her capability. They might question her politics, and Christine Ohms, same thing. But people are probably not going to question their capabilities. So they have a number of very good nominations. Mike Waltz over at the National Security Advisor, Rubio, as I mentioned. So they have a number of
Gabbard, RFK Jr.
The problem they have is that these unvetted nominations, RFK Jr., it clearly comes to mind, obviously, with the Secretary of Defense nominee. There are all kinds of problems there. What's really stunning about the process, at least in some of those cases, is that there's nobody from the transition team calling the Senate leadership, Republican leadership, about these nominations in advance. To kind of have them pre-clear some of these about potential nomination issues, nomination problems, and that's what is really stunning. I mean, that's how a functional presidency should operate. You just don't send a name over there blindly. You try to scrub it a bit first.
Charlie Dent, former Republican congressman of Pennsylvania, former chair of the House Ethics Committee. We appreciate the conversation, as always, on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up on Balance of Power, our conversation with Arne Duncan, the former Secretary of Education under the Obama administration, focused on President-elect Trump's plans to dismantle the Department of Education. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. We're glad you're with us. Today on the early edition of Balance of Power, I spoke with Arne Duncan, the former education secretary under the Obama administration. Asked him about Donald Trump's pick for education secretary, Linda McMahon, and whether she can carry out Donald Trump's promise to dismantle or eliminate the Department of Education, as Donald Trump says, send it back to the states. Here's a piece of our conversation.
I think it's almost impossible that he's going to eliminate the Department of Education. I honestly think that's just another empty campaign promise. And the fact is, the vast majority of funding K-12 actually comes from the states and local communities and districts. So send it back to the states. That's where the action already is. But your question is a good one. What does the department actually do? And I'll give you a couple of examples. It works very, very hard to make sure hundreds of thousands, millions of young children have access to high-quality pre-K, and getting our babies off to a great start is arguably the most important thing we can do. On the K-12 side, lots of funding for children with special needs, children with disabilities. That's desperately important, 7.5 million children. Lots of funding for children who live below the poverty line. At the higher education side, obviously does a tremendous amount to make college more accessible and more affordable. So sort of whether it's from babies to folks in college, the Department of Education plays a critical role, and to remove opportunity from children, from families, obviously makes no sense to me whatsoever.
What would it mean for funding for disabled students, Secretary?
Well, it's again, 7.5 million children with disabilities. And last time I checked, those are children whose families, some vote Democratic, some vote Republican. It just doesn't matter. And to see that funding disappear, to make sure that children now have access to a free and fair public education, that did not used to be the case. Many local districts used to discriminate and keep children with disabilities out of their public schools. It took the federal Department of Education, it took the intervention at the federal level to make sure children had that access. To take that away, that's not going to fly with parents. That's not, it would hurt children, it hurt families. Honestly, it would hurt the Republican Party. So my best advice to them would be to not even think about doing anything to hurt our most vulnerable children, whether children with disabilities, children with special needs, children who live below the poverty line. Those are the kids that need the best education we can provide them. They don't need something less than that.
I want to drill down a little bit more on what we were talking about, because while we did hear promises to eliminate the department, you don't seem to buy that, and I don't think Congress will either. We have some direction from the America First Policy Institute that has proposed changes on behalf of the Trump transition team, including stopping schools from, quote, promoting inaccurate and unpatriotic concepts, unquote, about American history surrounding institutionalized racism. This is critical race theory, I presume they're referring to. Secretary, what would that mean by the direction of a Trump-run Department of Education?
Right. And again, I just have to repeat myself. I hate the weaponization. I hate the politicization of anything having to do with education because it's so critical to our nation. What they do is they attack any three-letter acronym. So call it CRT, call it DEI, call it SEL. They attack that. Those aren't the issues that people are worried about. What are the real issues? We have tens of millions of children who are very far behind academically coming out of the pandemic. We have to help them catch up as fast as we can through high dosage tutoring. While we have kids that are chronically absent who haven't come back to school, we have to go find them, knock on doors, bring them in. We need to attract and retain the best teachers we can. This is a very tough time to be in education. We have to continue to raise high school graduation rates, because if you drop out of high school today, you're basically condemned to poverty and social failure. There are no good jobs out there for you. We have to educate our way to a better economy. We have to continue to make college more accessible and affordable. Those are the kinds of real issues that touch real parents and real children and real communities that whoever leads the Department of Education should be focused on.
You can find the full conversation with Arne Duncan, the former Secretary of Education, on the terminal or online. And our political panel is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Matt Gaetz withdrew from contention for Attorney General today. And we want to assemble our political panel now to discuss that. Christy Setzer, president and founder of New Heights Communications and Democratic strategist, alongside Sarah Chamberlain, president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership and Republican strategist. Ladies, thank you for joining us. Sarah, just to begin with, he, of course, is a former member of the House right now. A lot of members celebrated that. But could he make a return here? How much concern are you hearing on that regard?
So there's an open question there. He resigned from this Congress. Does it move into next Congress? They're not really sure. They think it probably does. And his wife kind of signaled today with her ex, right, that's the end of an era. I don't think that anyone would be disappointed if he does not come back in the House, frankly. Okay. So hopefully he moves on. He can run for governor of Florida, whatever else he'd like to do.
We should note that, as usual, Sarah told us this was going to happen. We can just tell the future when Sarah joins. I don't know which one of you loves Matt Gaetz more. We can have that out off the air if you want. But do you see this as a strategic play now in retrospect, as some said? Because we kept hearing up until the moment he withdrew that, no, Donald Trump is serious. He wants this man confirmed.
I think he was serious, but I think he was testing the limits of how far congressional Republicans were going to go for him, right? I think he was certainly willing to give up Matt Gaetz as AG because he's going to be able to find some other loyalist who's going to do his bidding for him. And I think what that says now is, does that mean that everyone else gets through as well? But that's clearly how I saw this was, to the Troy Nell's statement about if Donald Trump tells us to jump 3 feet into the left, we're going to jump 3 feet into the left. He wanted to test that out, and he will continue to.
Well, so as we consider whether there'll be other tests to come with, say, the defense secretary nominee, Pete Hegseth, who has been accused of sexual assault and in the news in that regard over the course of the last day, Sarah, is he going to get through now because of this, or was he going to get through possibly anyway?
I think he's going to get through. To be honest with you, I haven't talked to a lot of the members yet about that. We were really focused on Matt Gaetz.
Sure.
So I'll know more right after Thanksgiving, but I'm not sure. Right now, I think he does get through. I think Matt Gaetz was the scalp that they got, and now they're past the rest of them through the Senate. That's interesting.
We heard earlier today, actually, from some of the senators who may help to determine his fate. Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal, for instance, along with Republican Senator Josh Hawley. Here's what they said to the allegations surrounding Pete Hegseth. Listen.
I think this nomination is doomed. It should never have been made. It was never vetted. There was no background investigation.
We're in the season where all of this stuff, all of the Oppo research, so to speak, gets dumped into the press, and none of these people have an opportunity to say much substantively other than the occasional, passing interview. This is why we have confirmation hearings.
We should mention, peculiar timing or not, a police report from 2017 was made public last evening about the allegations, the event that led to this, that was settled out of court. It's pretty something here to read this. The records released show the woman told an emergency room nurse that she may have been drugged. This is something that is possible to clear in confirmation?
I mean, Donald Trump has put forth a cabinet of accused and more sexual assaulters. So he is obviously not the first person that Trump has put forward. Trump himself, it is important to remember, is a convicted rapist. This is something that not just Donald Trump is okay with, but again, the elected Republican leadership has shown, again, their supporters have shown that they are okay with again and again. Do I think it's okay? Of course I do not. Right. But I think that the standard has been here not just that they are unqualified for the job that they are being put up for. But in addition, there is some usually sexual assault, sexual harassment sort of scandal. That is what makes it sort of untenable. It is not the first test, which should be, frankly, the most important one, which is, are you qualified to do the job? Mm-hmm. And on that measure, I mean, again, you have to think that the answer for Pete Hegseth is no. He's doing what we are doing. He's good at, talking about news of the day. Is he good at running a department of 110,000 people? I can't imagine that he would be. But again, it's that strange brew of unqualifications and scandal that would be enough potentially to take him down, and I don't think it is.
Well, we should note, Kayleigh, that Hegseth does maintain his innocence, and Donald Trump was found liable. It wasn't a criminal case of rape. It's something that we'll hear about if we don't set the record straight.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I wonder what else we'll hear about in regard to Matt Gaetz, though. Sarah, do you think this ethics committee report is going to come out now? Is that something members want to get out there, just put this whole thing to bed?
Well, the chairman is a member of the Republican Main Street Partnership. It has been a long few days for him. I think you'll see bits and pieces of it come out. I don't think the entire report will come out now. Right now, Matt Gaetz is moving on to a different life. I think that we kind of know what's in the report. I don't think that you ever see the full report come to light of day.
Well, it's interesting to consider that he could still play a role, not only, as we suggested, maybe in this Congress, but in this White House. There are other roles that would not require confirmation. Does he remain a figure in Washington?
I don't believe so. I think he goes back to Florida.
Yeah.
I know he's looking to run for governor.
Mm-hmm.
I think he returns home. I think his days in D.C., I can't imagine Donald Trump putting him in any other position at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, we're waiting to hear who Donald Trump is going to put in one particular position, and that's Treasury Secretary Christie. He's taking his time with this one in a way we haven't seen with other areas of focus, suggesting that he does want to get the economy people right, or at least agreeable to Wall Street. The longer does this take as a Democrat? Do you feel more confident in the ultimate potential selection?
No. No, I don't. But I do think that he does take it seriously. I do think this is one where he actually cares about it personally. He cares about his own money and the fate of that. I will say that regardless of who he chooses, they have a pretty impossible task in selling Wall Street and the American public on steep tariffs and what that actually will mean for our economy, in addition to selling him on the broader pieces of the economic plan, on tariffs right after or right before we then try to put forth mass deportations. So they're going to have a really impossible job.
Christy Setzer, Sarah Chamberlain, great conversation. Thank you. By the way, Republicans flipped the seat in Alaska. What's the majority going to be? 2, 3?
2 or 3.
2 or 3. We'll let you know when it's official. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.